Thank you, Alistair. That was lovely. I would like to acknowledge Michelle Westling as Chief Executive of Standards Council and doing an excellent job. And thank you to my wife Jenny for help in this research. Let's imagine we're living in Surrey in England and the year is 1830. You're wealthy by the standards of the time. You might be a merchant or a trader. You might have a military commission. You could have owned land. You might be the lady of a house employing servants, and you're one of the 10% of people who are literate. You would be aware of discussion among your friends about the importance of logic and reason to challenge superstition and the dogma of religious belief. We now call this time the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. And around you in Surrey, however, was very high unemployment for the labouring class, which was 75% of the population. There was increasing mechanisation on farms, and that reduced the need for labourers. So many rural people were forced to move to overcrowded, unhealthy industrial cities. For these people, life was stressful, with ill health and injury common. There was a love of aggression in that society, and rioting was frequent. Childbirth could have fatal consequences because the causes of infection were not known. Unfortunately, a member of your family becomes mentally ill. Your husband or wife, brother or sister. You don't know what causes it, but they begin to act differently. It might be depression or neurosis. Could be schizophrenia or dementia, conditions which are mostly treatable today. Your friends view this behaviour as undesirable. The person is unreasonable, which doesn't sit well in a society of the Age of Reason. It suggested they be removed until they have recovered. Suppose for a moment that the mentally ill person is from the labouring class. Their employment could cease and they might become destitute or a pauper. Their prospects are now grim. The parish church could support them, but in cases of insanity they would end up in the public or county asylum. However, in the case of your family member, you can afford to pay for their care. You live to the west of London, so you pick one of the few good private asylums in Surrey, Great Foster's in Egham, close to Windsor, painting by John Hassel. It's a fine specimen of a Jacobean house dating from 1555. After being admitted, your patient would be allocated their room. There were 22 patients, 18 male and 4 female. This is a private asylum for the wealthy, so there were 16 servants to care for the patients. And one of these servants was my great-great-grandfather, John Boshier. As you see, he's strong and amiable and glad to have a job when many were unemployed. He was illiterate and base-born to an unmarried mother who probably was a servant in a large house in Harwell. From this unlikely start, he had a successful life and made enough money to assist his children to migrate to Australia and New Zealand in the 1870s. Now, just what was his job at Great Foster's? The treatment of mental illness for patients such as King George III was similar to that which a patient received for a physical illness. The surgeon followed the 4 humours doctrine. Health meant the balance of the humours, which were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm and blood. Physical illness was viewed as being unbalanced in a humour. So the patient would be either bled, blistered with heat, and then the blisters broken, purged or vomited. Special diets, including starvation, would also be used. A patient may need to be restrained while this was carried out. Many private asylums at this time also invoked forcible restraint if a patient was restless or violent. So shackles and a straitjacket would be used to chain a person to their bed or to the floor. These treatments would usually weaken a patient so they would become more compliant. And here is a scene in London's public hospital or public asylum, Bedlam, And it's called a Rake's Progress. And there's Tom Rakewell, manacled, head shaved, the bowl on the extreme bottom left for the vomit and so on. And you can see it really is a madhouse. The king's in his counting house counting out his money, and it's just a dreadful scene. It does look like a madhouse. Around 1790, a new approach emerged called moral treatment. In a private asylum called the Retreat, owned by the Quakers, patients were handled humanely, with a good diet and a minimum of restraint. A tankard of porter would be given to patients to help them sleep, rather than the laudanum, or tincture of opium, used in other asylums as a sedative. Social leaders in this age of enlightenment saw the results and realised there had to be a better way than the scenes at Bedlam. So the County Asylums Act for the better care and maintenance of lunatics was passed in 1808. Treatments for insanity did not change, but restraint was discouraged and had to be recorded every time it was used. The Act provided that private asylums could take pauper patients if the county paid for their care. As a result, the private asylums began to compete with the public asylums for patients, and a market between the two began. It was sometimes called the trade in lunacy. Great Fosters was one of the early adopters of moral treatment. In 1815, 3 surgeons took over the madhouse licence for Great Fosters. One was George Furnivall, a physician in Egham whose medical patients included the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. They entered the new mental business. Here's their advertisement. Great Foster's House, a retreat for the mentally afflicted. The greatest attention is paid to the bodily health and personal comfort of the patients. Furnivall was also a landowner, and he saw the opportunity to create a profitable company in buying Great Foster's when it came up for sale in 1818. Thus began John Boshier's employment, probably as a labourer in the grounds. At this time, the Enclosures Act did away with the commons, so new roads, fences and drains needed to be built in Surrey. John married a lady called Rebecca Dayborn, and they lived all their lives in a Georgian house, still there today, near the town of Virginia Water. It's just 20 minutes walk from Great Foster's. Rebecca died after childbirth when she was 40 years old, sadly. In the late 1820s, John graduated to be an attendant in the house. For this job, he needed to be tall and strong rather than have any medical knowledge. An attendant in those times was known as a keeper of lunatics. They could well exercise considerable power over the patients, at the same time being a link between them and the outside world. One of the threads in my book is just how much John's job was to change from 1820 to when he retired in 1865, a remarkable 40 years working in an asylum. During this time, after the death of King George III in 1820, the interest of the medical profession in the true nature of mental illness began. The term psychiatry for the Greek mind healer had been coined by Johann Riehl in 1808, the same year as the County Asylums Act became law. The first textbook on psychiatry, however, was not to appear for 30 years. There was a new Madhouses Act in 1828. It provided for the admission of private patients by the application of a family member, following certification by 2 doctors. Inspectors, termed county visitors, were empowered to release a patient if, after 3 visits, they considered a person was being detained unnecessarily. The family was required to visit the patient once every 6 months, and there is a coach with the family leaving the asylum. In the 1830s, treatment methods for insanity began to be overhauled. The first asylum to ban restraint was Lincoln in 1838. The most far-reaching of all of the legislative reforms came in 1845 with the Lunatics Act. Certification procedures, including regular inspections, were required of all asylums. Medical physicians were required to be constantly available. Now, one of the most important asylum attendants was Dr. John Connolly at Hanwell, London. Hanwell was opened in 1831. It was the first purpose-built public asylum with 1,000 beds, increasing, get this, to 3,800 beds in the 1960s. His textbook of 1847 was later very influential in specifying how asylums should operate. One of the most important, he had the view that there should be a routine in the hospital and that patients should always have different employments to occupy them. He wanted his attendants to be non-violent, kindly, and not accept payments directly from patients. And in 1845, he did the first real categorisation of his 800 patients in 1845. So mania, which is, we call basically delusional behaviour, melancholia, we now call depression, hypochondria, which hasn't changed its meaning, a belief that symptoms mean illness, monomania, which is obsessive-compulsive delusion, incoherence, we now call schizophrenia or chronic confusion, imbecility, all other impairments and neuroses, dementia, mental deterioration of the aged, and idiocy, which is a severe kind of neurological disorder, sometimes from birth. Notice that schizophrenia is the biggest representative number, 277. Frustrated at his ideas being constantly negated, Connolly resigned after 4 years in the job. John Boshier worked through all this change and retired from Great Fosters when it closed in an asylum in 1867. He was then aged 73 and had worked for the one employer for 45 years caring for mental patients. Can you imagine that? Some of us find it difficult enough simply visiting a dementia unit in a modern rest home. His wages were very low and remained at £18 a year all his working life, less than a labourer's wage. But he did make considerable money, no doubt in tips from his wealthy patients, against what John Connolly would have wanted. His house was rent-free. He received coal from a philanthropist. He died in 1870 and is buried in Englefield Green, and those of you who've been there know it's now a very respectable place. Great Fosters became a hotel in 1930, and it was used as accommodation for film actors at the nearby Shepperton and Pinewood film studios. It's now gained reputation as one of the small luxury hotels of the world. That's the Great Hall. It's a fascinating place to explore. The gardens in winter. John's Georgian house is now lived in by a professor at London University. His family survive in Australia, New Zealand and the UK, but all his grandsons in Surrey were killed in Flanders in 1916, so the name has ceased to exist in Egham. Well, President and members, we've shared the story of a remarkable life. To work, I think, for 45 years in a mental asylum and to emerge sane with one's savings intact is an outstanding achievement. I wanted to tell the story and I called it In the Mental Business.